The letter arrived on a Tuesday, thin and brittle as a dead leaf. Constance Bellamy was polishing the silver, a task her aunt, Arabella Draycott, insisted she perform personally, as if the Bellamy family's reduced circumstances had somehow uniquely qualified Constance's hands for the menial. Mrs. Draycott held the letter between two fingers, a faint look of distaste on her face. "It is from the solicitors for the Severn estate," she announced to the room, though only Constance and her cousin Louisa were present. Louisa, embroidering a rather lopsided robin, did not look up. Constance continued her steady, circular motion on a Georgian teapot, her reflection a distorted, solemn mask in its belly. "He requires an agent, a manager, someone to take that ruin, Withercombe, in hand." Arabella's eyes, small and hard as currants, fixed on Constance. "They say the place has failed for 20 years, that Gideon Severn is a ghost in his own house, lost to grief and mismanagement. No one has made it profitable. It is a fool's errand." She let the silence stretch, a weapon she wielded with practiced skill. Constance set the teapot down, her hands still. She knew what was coming. It was always this way, a problem, an impossibility, and then the turning of her aunt's gaze upon her. "You will go," Arabella said. It was not a question. "You will make that wasteland profitable before the harvest. Mr. Hollis, who has been so very generous to us, holds an interest in the neighboring lands. He believes a competent hand could stabilize the district. He suggested you." The mention of Mr. Lucian Hollis was the key. He was a man of new money and old ambitions, and he held the notes on the Draycotts' mounting debts. This was his command, delivered through her aunt's thin lips. "If you succeed," Arabella continued, a sliver of false magnanimity in her tone, "Mr. Hollis has agreed to speak with me about the outstanding matter of your upbringing. Your debt to this family will be considered settled. If you fail—" She did not need to finish. Failure meant a life of indentured servitude to her aunt's whims, a gray and shrinking future. Constance thought of the ledgers she balanced every night, the careful economies she practiced that kept this household afloat, the invisible labor that earned her nothing but a bed in a cold attic room. She thought of her father, a brilliant man ruined by a bad investment, who had left her nothing but a small, strange ring of tarnished silver keys and the advice to always trust numbers, for they could not lie. She looked at her hands, clean and capable. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. "I will need the estate records for the last 5 years," she said, her voice even. "And a map of the tenancy." Arabella's lips thinned. She'd expected pleading, or perhaps a flicker of fear. She received only quiet competence. "It will be arranged. You leave on Friday." That night, Constance packed her single worn trunk. She folded her 3 drab dresses, her spare stockings, her father's book of accounts. At the bottom, she placed the ring of silver keys. They were oddly shaped, fitting no lock she had ever encountered. They felt cool and solid in her palm, a tangible link to a past she barely remembered, and a promise of something. She did not know what. As she closed the lid, the sound of laughter drifted up from the drawing room below. Louisa was playing the pianoforte, inexpertly, while her mother entertained Mr. Hollis. Constance was already a ghost in this house. Perhaps, she thought, she would be suited to a place run by another. Withercombe. The name itself sounded like an ending. For her, it would have to be a beginning. The journey to Ottersley was 2 days by coach, through rolling hills that grew bleaker and more windswept the further west she travelled. Withercombe itself was not visible from the road. It lay down a long, rutted lane, choked with overgrown yew trees that clawed at the carriage windows. The house, when it finally emerged from the gloom, was a sprawling stone edifice of indeterminate age, stained dark with rain and neglect. It was grand, but it was a sleeping giant, breathing a slow, shallow breath of decay. A woman with a face as grim and weathered as the stone walls met her at the door. Her apron was clean, but her expression was not welcoming. "I am Hannah," she said, her voice flat. "Housekeeper. Mr. Severn does not receive visitors." "I am not a visitor," Constance replied, stepping over the threshold into a hall that smelled of damp stone and absence. "I am Miss Bellamy, the new estate agent." Hannah's gaze swept over Constance's plain traveling dress and her single trunk. It was a look that dismissed her utterly. "There have been others," the housekeeper said, as if that explained everything. "The master is in his wing. He is not to be disturbed." Constance did not argue. She asked to be shown the estate office. The room was a time capsule of failure. Dust lay thick as felt on every surface. The ledgers on the shelves were in disarray, some stained with damp, their spines broken. A single map of the estate, yellowed and cracked, was pinned to the wall. For 2 days, Constance saw no one but Hannah, who brought her a tray of plain food twice a day and collected it in silence. Constance did not mind the solitude. She worked by the light of a single oil lamp, her fingers becoming smudged with ink and dust. She read, she calculated, she cross-referenced. The story the ledgers told was not one of cursed land or bad luck. It was a story of apathy, of orders never given, of tenants left to their own devices, of supplies ordered and paid for that, according to the delivery dockets, never seemed to arrive. There was waste here, and something that looked uncomfortably like theft. On the 3rd night, she was tracing the path of a stream on the old map, a stream that should have fed the defunct watermill, when a shadow fell across the page. She did not startle. She simply looked up. He was taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered in a severe, dark coat that had seen better days. His face was all sharp angles and shadow, his hair dark and unkempt. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, clear grey, and they were utterly empty, like windows on a vacant house. This was Gideon Severn, the ghost of Withercombe. He did not introduce himself. He did not greet her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rasp, rough with disuse. "What are you doing with my father's books?" Constance met his gaze without flinching. Her heart beat a steady, quiet rhythm. She gestured to the neat columns she had drawn on a fresh sheet of paper, a summary of income and expenditure that spanned a decade. "I am trying to understand," she said, her voice clear in the silent room. "Why a good farm fails." He stepped further into the light of the lamp. His gaze dropped from her face to the ledger, then to her hands, which rested, calm and capable, on the page. He saw the ink stains on her fingers. He saw the focused, intelligent clarity in her eyes. He had seen a parade of agents sent by distant solicitors, all of them full of bluster or pity. They had wrung their hands, spoken of tragedy, and quietly padded their expense accounts before retreating. This woman was different. She had not spoken of his grief. She had spoken of the farm. He studied her for a full minute, the silence stretching until it was a tangible thing between them. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows from which he had come. Constance listened to his footsteps recede down the stone corridor, a slow, heavy tread. Then she took a breath, dipped her pen in the inkwell, and returned to her work. The ghost had shown himself. Now the real work could begin. He came again the next evening, and the evening after that. He never spoke. He would simply stand in the doorway of the office, watching her work. Constance did not acknowledge his presence beyond a brief initial glance. She continued her methodical examination of Withercombe's slow collapse, her pen scratching rhythmically in the quiet. She was compiling a new ledger, a true one, noting discrepancies, questioning invoices, mapping the flow of money out of the estate. She found that the bailiff, a man who had retired 2 years prior, was still drawing a pension that had mysteriously doubled. She found that the grain merchant in Ottersley, a Mr. Finch, was charging Withercombe 20% more than any other farm in the county. It was a web of petty corruption and profound neglect, spun over years of a master's inattention. On the 4th night, Gideon Seven finally spoke again. "My solicitor informs me you were sent by Mrs. Draycott." His voice was still rough, but clearer now. "She is a grasping woman. What does she hope to gain from this?" Constance looked up, her expression unreadable. "She hopes I will fail," she answered plainly. "My failure would place me further in her debt. My success, however, clears it." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, moved in the depths of his grey eyes. It was not the answer he had expected. He had assumed she was a pawn in some scheme to acquire his land. Honesty, so plainly delivered, was a foreign currency in his world. "And do you expect to succeed?" he asked, a note of cynicism in his tone. "The land is not the problem," Constance stated, gesturing to her soil analysis notes, compiled from conversations with the few remaining tenants. "The water is not the problem. The management is the problem. Or the lack of it." She stood and walked to the large map on the wall. "The watermill has been idle for 15 years. Restoring it would allow us to grind our own flour and sell it at a premium, rather than selling raw grain at a loss. The north fields are ideal for barley, but they have been left fallow. The tenancy agreements are a decade out of date. The tenants pay too little, and in return they receive no support. They have no incentive to improve their yields." She spoke with a quiet, irrefutable authority. It was the voice of numbers, of logic, of evidence. She was not offering opinions. She was stating facts. Gideon moved to stand beside her, his gaze following her finger as she traced the lines on the map. He was close enough now that she could feel a faint warmth from him, could smell the scent of old books and something wild, like the wind off the moors. For 20 years he had been encased in the amber of his grief, the world a muffled, distant thing. This woman, with her calm voice and her inescapable facts, was a sharp, clear note in the long silence. "What do you propose?" he asked. "A new contract with the tenants, offering them a share of the profits in exchange for meeting production targets," she said, her plan already fully formed. "Fire the bailiff, who is a thief. Terminate the contract with Mr. Finch and sell our grain on the open market in Kingsbrook. And hire a millwright to restore the mill. It will take capital, which the estate does not have. The home farm will have to provide it." He turned to face her. "The home farm is derelict." "It is fallow," she corrected him gently. "It is not dead. We plant potatoes. A quick crop, hardy. It requires minimal investment but intensive labor. It will feed the staff and the tenants through the winter, and the surplus can be sold to raise the capital for the millwright." He saw the entire harvest season laid out in her mind, a clear and logical path through a wilderness of neglect. He saw the risk. He also saw the first glimmer of hope he had felt in 2 decades. It was not pity that moved him. It was something harder and more respectful. It was the recognition of competence. "My aunt believes this to be a fool's errand," Constance said, her voice dropping slightly. "She does not believe it can be done before the harvest." "And you?" Gideon asked, his gaze locked on hers. "I believe the numbers," she said. He reached into his coat and produced a heavy, rusted iron key. He held it out to her. "This is the key to the main office," he said. "The one with my father's private accounts. You will have access to everything. You have until the first frost. You will have the authority you require." Constance took the key. It was heavy in her palm. A transactional bond. A reluctant alliance. "Succeed," he said, his voice a low command. "And your aunt will have no more claim on you. Fail, and Withercombe will take you with it." She slid the iron key onto the ring with her father's silver ones. They made a faint, metallic music in the silent house. "I do not intend to fail, Mr. Severn," she said. The transformation of Withercombe began not with a grand gesture, but with the small, repetitive sounds of work. The squeak of a wheelbarrow, the rhythmic thud of a hoe, the low murmur of voices where there had only been silence. Constance did not command from the dusty office. She was in the fields at dawn with the handful of laborers they could afford to hire, her hands in the same soil, her back bent to the same task. She showed them the most efficient way to plant the potato sets, a method she had read about in an agricultural journal, and when they saw it worked, a grudging respect began to seed itself in the stony ground of their skepticism. She renegotiated the tenancy agreements herself, sitting in the small, damp cottages and speaking plainly. She did not make grand promises. She showed them the numbers. She offered a partnership. In return for their hard work, they would receive not just a wage, but a share. For the first time in years, the tenants of Withercombe saw a future that was not simply a continuation of a bleak past. Slowly, the loyalty dominoes began to fall. The first was Hannah. The grim housekeeper watched Constance return from the fields each evening, weary but resolute, her dress stained with mud. She watched her eat the simple fare without complaint. One evening, Constance found a bowl of hot stew left on her desk in the office, thick with vegetables from the kitchen garden. No words were exchanged, but the gesture was a treaty. The house was beginning to wake up. Windows were unshuttered to let in the summer light. The scent of beeswax replaced the smell of damp. Constance, in the few hours she had between the estate work and the ledgers, discovered a walled garden behind the west wing, a tangled, forgotten Eden. She began to clear it, one small patch at a time, untangling the vicious thorns to reveal the delicate, persistent roses beneath. Gideon watched it all. He had intended to retreat back into his wing, to let her succeed or fail on her own terms. But he found he could not. He would stand at his window and watch her in the garden, her face smudged with dirt, a look of quiet concentration as she pruned a dying branch. He walked the fields at dawn, before anyone was awake, and saw the neat rows of green shoots pushing through the dark earth. He heard the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer repairing the old plows. These were the sounds of life, and they were drawing him out of his tomb. He found the millwright himself, an old man from Felbridge who remembered Gideon's grandfather. He stood beside Constance as she explained what was needed, and when the millwright quoted a price, Gideon did not bargain. He simply said, "Begin." From the perspective of Gideon Severn, for 20 years, silence had been his only companion. It was a physical presence in the house, thick as dust, heavy as a shroud. After the carriage accident had taken his wife and his infant son, the world had lost its color, its sound, its meaning. Withercombe, his inheritance, became his mausoleum. He had let it decay around him, a fitting monument to the ruin within his own soul. He had greeted the succession of agents with the same mute indifference. They were flies buzzing at the window of his grief, an irritation to be endured until they flew away. Then came Constance Bellamy. He had watched her that first night in the office, her head bent over the crooked ledgers of his family's failure. He had expected to see the same avarice or pity he saw in all the others. Instead, he saw order. She was bringing order to chaos, sense to nonsense. It was a small, quiet act of rebellion against the decay he had cultivated. He had given her the key as a test, a challenge. He did not truly believe she could succeed. He did not truly believe in anything. But she did not falter. He watched her from the shadows, a habit of his long solitude. He saw her talk to the tenants not as a superior, but as an equal, her head tilted as she listened to their complaints. He saw her hands, blistered and raw from her work in the potato fields, and felt a strange, unwelcome pang in his chest. It was not pity. It was a stark, painful admiration. One afternoon, he found her in the walled garden. She was on her knees, carefully tending a single, stubborn rose bush that had survived the years of neglect. A smudge of dirt was on her cheek, and her hair had come loose from its severe bun. She looked up and saw him, and for a moment her composure wavered. He saw a flash of vulnerability in her eyes before the calm mask slipped back into place. He said nothing, simply watched as she tied the rose to a stake. She was not just reviving a garden. She was not just reviving an estate. She was, with her quiet, relentless competence, showing him that things could live again. The thought was terrifying. It was a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for 2 decades. Through that crack, a sliver of light was beginning to penetrate, and it was agonizing. He found himself thinking of her at night, not of her face or form, but of the steady scratch of her pen in the silent house. It was the sound of a heartbeat. Withercombe had a heart again. He was not yet sure if he did. But as he watched her press the dark soil around the roots of the rose, he knew, with a certainty that shook him, that he could not bear for her to fail. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The news of Withercombe's stirring rippled through the county like a stone thrown in a stagnant pond. In the drawing rooms of Ottersley, it was first a source of amusement, then of curiosity, and finally of concern for a select few. Mrs. Arabella Draycott heard the whispers over tea and was deeply displeased. She had sent her niece to a graveyard, expecting her to be buried under the weight of its failure. Instead, the girl was apparently tilling the soil. It was unseemly. And it was inconvenient. Mr. Lucian Hollis, a man whose polished manners concealed a ruthless ambition, was more than concerned. He was alarmed. For years he had been patiently acquiring the lands surrounding Withercombe, waiting for the final collapse of the Severn estate to purchase it for a pittance. He had seen Gideon Severn as a broken man, an easy mark. He had seen Constance Bellamy as a tool, a final, delicate instrument to pry the last bit of life from the place before he moved in. Her unexpected success was a direct threat to his carefully laid plans. He paid a visit to Mrs. Draycott. They sat in her perfectly appointed parlor, their conversation a low murmur of shared interest. "The girl is getting above herself," Hollis said, swirling the brandy in his glass. "There are rumors she is influencing Mr. Severn in ways that are not entirely proper." Arabella's face tightened. "Constance has always had a stubborn, practical streak. It is most unbecoming." "It must be stopped," Hollis said smoothly. "For her own good, of course, and for the protection of poor Mr. Severn, who is clearly not in his right mind." The opposition began subtly. A social chill descended upon the name of Withercombe. When Constance went to Ottersley to purchase supplies, shopkeepers who had been friendly were suddenly cool and distant. Vague, unpleasant rumors began to circulate that Miss Bellamy was an adventuress, taking advantage of a grieving man, that she was running the estate into further debt with her reckless schemes. Constance felt the shift, but she ignored it. She had no time for gossip. The barley was growing strong in the Northfields, and the watermill was almost operational. Then the attacks became more direct. A shipment of specialized milling stones ordered from Kingsbrook arrived shattered, the driver claiming the road was simply too rough. Constance knew it was sabotage, but she could not prove it. She spent 3 days with the millwright, painstakingly piecing the stones back together with iron bands and cement, a solution he declared both ingenious and unprecedented. Next, the contract she had secured with a baker in Marley for their first batch of flour was abruptly cancelled. The baker, a timid man, stammered something about hearing unsettling financial news. Constance knew the source of the news was Hollis. She simply adjusted her plans, arranging to sell the flour directly at the local market, cutting out the middleman entirely. She met each obstacle with the same calm, logical resolve. But she could feel the net tightening. Hollis and her aunt were not merely trying to hinder her, they were trying to break her. The final assault came on a crisp autumn morning. Mr. Hollis arrived at Withercombe in his gleaming carriage, a look of profound concern etched on his handsome face. He was not alone. He had brought with him Mr. Draycott's solicitor, a man whose loyalty was to whoever paid his fees. Gideon met them in the main hall. It was the first time he had formally received guests in 20 years. He stood tall and severe, with Constance at his side. Hollis did not waste time on pleasantries. He produced a sheaf of documents with a flourish of regret. "My dear Severn," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "In the process of managing some of my family's older accounts, I have uncovered a most unfortunate obligation. A debt, a rather substantial one, owed by your late father to mine. It seems it was never settled." He pushed a promissory note across the table. It was for £5,000, an astronomical sum that would bankrupt the estate just as it was poised on the brink of its first profitable harvest in 2 decades. The document was yellowed with age, the signature at the bottom a passable imitation of the late Mr. Severn's hand. "Of course," Hollis continued smoothly, "I have no wish to cause you distress. I would be willing to forgive the entire sum, in exchange for the deed to the Northfields. A small price to pay to avoid ruin, you'll agree." Gideon stared at the document. £5,000. The number was a blow to the gut. He remembered his father's final years, a fog of bad investments and desperate ventures. A debt of this magnitude was not impossible. It felt horribly, sickeningly plausible. The carefully rebuilt walls of his composure began to crumble. The old ghosts of failure and despair rushed back in, whispering in his ear that Withercombe was cursed, that he was cursed, that all hope was a fool's dream. His gaze fell on Constance. She stood beside him, her face pale but her expression calm. For one terrible, fracturing moment, doubt, cold and poisonous, seeped into his mind. Her aunt. Mr. Hollis. Was this the true purpose of her presence here? Was her competence, her tireless work, all just an elaborate performance to soften him for this final, devastating betrayal? Had he, in his loneliness, mistaken a predator for a partner? The silence in the hall was absolute. Hollis watched him, a hawk waiting for its prey to fall. Gideon turned to Constance, and the emptiness was back in his eyes, a wintry landscape of grief and suspicion. He did not shout. He did not accuse. His voice was quiet, freighted with the weight of his returning despair. "Is this what you were sent for?" he asked. The question hung in the air, more brutal than any blow. For Constance, it was the breaking of a dam she had spent a lifetime building. Not the false accusations of Hollis, not the petty cruelties of her aunt, but this quiet, devastating question from the one person she had thought finally saw her for what she was. A hot, furious energy surged through her. It was not the prelude to tears. It was the cold fire of righteous anger. She did not look at Hollis. Her eyes were fixed on Gideon. "No," she said, her voice low and shaking with a controlled rage he had never heard. "This is not what I was sent for." She turned not to him, but to the heavy oak table. She strode to the estate office and returned, her arms laden with her own ledgers. She slammed them down, the sound echoing in the cavernous hall. "You prize evidence, Mr. Severn," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "Then look at it." She opened a book, her finger tracing a line of neat script. "This is the record of every penny spent since my arrival. This is the new tenancy agreement that has tripled the yield from the south pasture. This," she said, producing another book, "is the grain sales ledger. We are not on the brink of ruin. For the first time in 20 years, Withercombe is solvent." Then she turned to the forged document. She did not touch it, as if it were contaminated. "That note is dated the 10th of June, 22 years ago. I have read your father's journals. On that day, he was in London, meeting with his bankers. There is a record of it." Her memory, precise and unwavering, was a weapon. "The signature does not loop correctly on the S. Your father's hand was meticulous. This is a clumsy imitation." She finally lifted her gaze back to Gideon, and all the hurt, all the indignation was there for him to see. "I have given this place my honest work. I have given it everything I have. Do not ask me if I am a thief. Look at the evidence and decide for yourself who is lying." Her words, plain and true, sliced through the fog of his doubt. He looked from her fierce, honest face to the smug, predatory expression on Hollis's. He saw the truth. He saw the lie. He saw the woman who had brought his home and his heart back from the dead, and the shame of his momentary distrust was a physical pain. He reached out and placed his hand over hers on top of the ledger. A silent apology. A declaration of alliance. "Thank you, Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He then turned his gaze, now cold as iron, upon Lucian Hollis. "My agent has presented her evidence. The matter appears to be settled. Now, get out of my house." Hollis's composure finally broke. A tide of angry red washed over his face. "This is not over," he snarled. "There are other ways to collect a debt." "Then I suggest you try them," Gideon said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Together," he added, his eyes meeting Constance's, "we will answer." Lucian Hollis was not a man to accept public defeat. He intended to make his case not in the quiet halls of Withercombe, but in the court of county opinion. He arranged for the matter of the unsettled Severn debt to be raised at the quarterly meeting of the Ottersley Agricultural Board, a gathering of the county's most influential landowners and merchants. His strategy was clear: to isolate Gideon Severn, paint him as an unstable recluse being manipulated by an ambitious woman, and use the social pressure of his peers to force the sale of the land. The meeting was held in the Ottersley Town Hall, a stuffy, wood-paneled room that smelled of old paper and self-importance. Arabella Draycott was in attendance, dressed in somber grey, the very picture of a concerned relative. She sat near the front, ready to weep for her poor, misguided niece and the tragic Mr. Severn. When Gideon and Constance entered, a hush fell over the room. It was the first time Gideon had been seen at a public gathering in 2 decades. He was not the stooped, wild-eyed madman of the rumors. He was dressed in a well-tailored black coat, his bearing erect, his expression grimly determined. Constance walked beside him, her head held high, a simple portfolio of documents clutched in her hands. Hollis began his presentation with practiced solemnity. He spoke of his deep respect for the Severn family, his sorrow at their misfortunes, and his discovery of the painful debt. He passed the forged promissory note among the board members, who examined it with grave expressions. "I have no desire to be punitive," Hollis concluded, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "I merely wish to see this sad affair resolved. My offer to take the Northfields in exchange for the debt still stands. It is, I believe, the only compassionate solution." The chairman of the board, a portly squire named Fletcher, cleared his throat. "Mr. Severn, have you any response?" Gideon rose to his feet. The room held its breath. "I do," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "Mr. Hollis is correct about one thing. There is a sad affair to be resolved here today. The affair of a clumsy forgery and a fraudulent claim." A collective gasp went through the assembly. Hollis shot to his feet. "I will not be slandered!" "You will be answered with evidence," Gideon said calmly. He turned to Constance. "Miss Bellamy, if you please." All eyes turned to the quiet woman in the plain dress. She stepped forward and opened her portfolio on the main table. There was no tremor in her hands. "Mr. Hollis's document is a fabrication," she began, her voice precise and clear. "I present the household ledgers of Withercombe, which show that on the supposed date of this loan, the late Mr. Severn was not in Ottersley, but in London. I have here a certified copy of his travel itinerary from his journals." She laid the first document down. "Furthermore," she continued, "I present a letter from the chief clerk of the London Bank, confirming that on that date, Mr. Severn deposited a significant sum, making such a loan entirely unnecessary." She laid down the second document. A murmur went through the crowd. Hollis's face had gone pale. But Constance was not finished. "The final piece of evidence," she said, "concerns the debt itself." From a small purse, she produced the ring of old keys her father had left her. The assembly watched, mystified, as she selected one of the small, tarnished silver keys. She then gestured to the old, iron-bound document box from the Severn estate, which she had requested be brought as evidence. "This box contains the settled accounts of the last 50 years. It has a lock no one has been able to open." She inserted the silver key. There was a faint click. The lock sprang open. The room was utterly silent. From a hidden compartment within the lid of the box, Constance retrieved a single, folded vellum document. "My father was a clerk for the Severn estate before his death," she explained softly. "He was a man of great integrity. He preserved this. It is the original loan agreement between the late Mr. Severn and Mr. Hollis's father. And attached to it," she said, her voice ringing with quiet triumph, "is the receipt for payment in full, dated and signed 20 years ago." She placed the document on the table. The proof was irrefutable. The silence was broken by a sharp, commanding voice. "May I see that?" Lady Theodosia Fenwick, a formidable dowager with eyes like a hawk, strode to the table. She was the most respected and most feared woman in the county. She examined the documents, her sharp gaze missing nothing. She looked at the forgery, then at the original. After a long moment, she looked up, her eyes fixing on Lucian Hollis with contempt. "This," she declared, holding up the receipt, "is the truth. And this," she said, flicking the forgery with her fingernail, "is a pathetic and criminal lie." The public humiliation was swift and total. The board members turned their backs on Hollis. Arabella Draycott began to make a show of fainting, but Lady Fenwick cut her off. "And you, madam," she snapped, "can spare us the theatrics. Your part in this grubby little conspiracy is as plain as the nose on your face." Ruined. In the space of 10 minutes, Lucian Hollis and Arabella Draycott were utterly and publicly ruined. Gideon looked at Constance, who was quietly gathering her papers. He saw not a vengeful victor, but a woman whose quiet competence and unwavering integrity had brought the truth into the light. And in that moment, he knew his life had been irrevocably changed, not by the exposure of a lie, but by the presence of this remarkable, plain-spoken woman. They returned to Withercombe as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The carriage ride was silent, but it was a comfortable, shared quiet, not the empty silence of before. The victory in the town hall did not feel like a triumph so much as a restoration of order, a balancing of the books. When they arrived, Hannah met them at the door, her weathered face split by a rare, genuine smile. "Lady Fenwick's coachman stopped by on his way through, sir," she said. "He told us what happened. The staff, we're all very proud." It was a simple statement, but it meant the world. Withercombe was no longer just a house. It was a home with a loyal heart. Gideon dismissed the carriage and walked with Constance toward the walled garden. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and late-blooming roses. The first frost was not far off. She had met her deadline. The garden, once a riot of thorns and weeds, was now an oasis of order and beauty. The rose bushes she had tended were heavy with fragrant blossoms. They stood for a moment, looking at the fruits of her labor, a small, perfect symbol of the larger miracle she had wrought on the estate. Gideon turned to face her. The last light of day softened the harsh angles of his face, and his eyes, once so empty, were filled with a profound and steady warmth. "When you came here," he began, his voice low, "I saw you as a solution to a problem, an agent, an employee." He reached out and took her hands in his. They were not the soft, useless hands of a society lady. They were capable, calloused from work, yet they felt delicate and strong in his own. "I was wrong," he continued. "You were not the solution. You were the truth. You brought truth back to this house, and to me." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "Withercombe is solvent. The harvest is successful. Your debt to your aunt is cleared. You are free to leave." The words hung in the air. She was free. She could walk away from the cold, damp house, the long hours, the man with the wounded heart. She could find a position anywhere now, her reputation secured. But the thought of leaving Withercombe, of leaving him, was a sudden sharp ache in her chest. She looked around the garden, at the sturdy stone walls of the house, at the man standing before her, and realized this place of ruin had become the only home she had ever known. She started, but her voice failed her. Gideon's grip on her hands tightened gently. "You did not save Withercombe, Constance," he said, using her given name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. "You reminded it what it was. You reminded me who I am." With a fluid grace that surprised her, he went down on one knee on the soft grass of the garden path. He did not release her hands. He held them as he looked up at her, his gaze direct and filled with a raw, unadorned sincerity that stole her breath. "My name, my home, my life. They are worthless without an honest steward. I am not asking you to be my agent. I am asking you to be the mistress of Withercombe. I am asking you to be my wife." He paused, his heart in his eyes. "Answer plainly." Constance, who had faced down bullies and liars, who had wrestled a dying estate back to life, who had never once cried in self-pity, felt the hot, unfamiliar sting of tears. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. She, the plain, overlooked niece, the invisible laborer, was being seen. She was being chosen. Her voice, when she found it, was not much more than a whisper, but it was steady. "Yes," she said. "Plainly. Yes." He rose and drew her into his arms. He did not kiss her with fiery passion, but with a deep, reverent tenderness. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, of a love that had grown quietly, like the roses, in the neglected soil of two lonely hearts. It was a promise of a shared future, built not on rescue, but on recognition. Together. 1 year later, the scent of wood smoke and roasting apples hung in the autumn air. The harvest festival at Withercombe was in full swing. The great lawn, once a field of weeds, was now filled with tenants and their families, their faces bright with laughter. Music from a local fiddler drifted from a decorated marquee, and long tables groaned under the weight of the feast. Withercombe was not just solvent, it was prosperous. The flour from its restored mill was known as the finest in the county. The barley crop had been sold at a tremendous profit. The estate was vibrantly, indisputably alive. Constance Severn moved through the celebration, a quiet word here, a shared smile there. She was no longer Miss Bellamy, the stern agent, but the mistress of the estate, respected and loved. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, the color of a twilight sky, and her only adornment was the plain gold band on her finger. Gideon was at her side, no longer a ghost in his own home. He spoke with his tenants, inquiring about their children, discussing plans for the next season. The harsh lines of grief on his face had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He laughed, a deep, warm sound that Constance had come to cherish, as a small child presented him with a lumpy turnip carved into a frightening face. From the terrace, Lady Theodosia Fenwick watched them, a rare smile on her sharp features. She had become a frequent visitor to Withercombe and a fierce champion of its mistress. "You see," she said to the local vicar who stood beside her, "competence. It is a more powerful force than beauty or charm. That girl," she nodded toward Constance, "is worth a dozen society belles. She rebuilt this place with nothing but a sharp mind and an honest heart." Constance spotted a familiar figure standing near the edge of the crowd, looking hesitant. It was her cousin, Louisa. After the public disgrace, the Draycott household had collapsed. Mr. Hollis had fled the county to escape his creditors and his shame. Arabella, stripped of her social standing, had retired to a small cottage in Bath, her spirit finally broken. Louisa, left with nothing, had surprised everyone. She had found a position as a governess for a family in Kingsbrook. She was thinner now, and the fashionable silliness had been replaced by a quiet maturity. Constance went to her. "Louisa, I am so glad you could come." Louisa flushed, unable to meet her cousin's eye. I wanted to apologize," she stammered. "For my mother. For everything. I was weak. I never stood up for you." "You are standing up for yourself now," Constance said gently. "That is what matters." She took her cousin's hand. The reconciliation was not total, the years of slights not entirely erased, but it was a beginning. It was a mending. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had departed, Gideon and Constance stood in the quiet of the main office. The room was no longer dusty and forgotten. It was the warm, beating heart of the estate, with a fire crackling in the hearth. On the wall, in a simple oak frame, hung a velvet board. Upon it, gleaming in the firelight, were 2 keys. One was the heavy, rusted iron key to the estate. The other was the small, intricate silver key that had unlocked the final truth. Gideon came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and together they looked at the display. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "He gave you the key. You provided the courage to turn it." "He taught me to trust numbers," Constance replied, leaning back against him. "But I have learned that the most important things, trust, respect, love, cannot be entered in a ledger." Gideon turned her in his arms to face him. He looked at her, his wife, his partner, the architect of their shared happiness, and his heart was full. "No," he agreed. "They cannot." He kissed her, a slow, deep kiss filled with the quiet joy of a harvest brought home, a promise of many seasons yet to come. They stood together by the fire, 2 solitudes joined, looking out the window at the moonlit fields of Withercombe, their shared and prosperous home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.